Welcome. Welcome to Reading to Mom, Episode 4. My name is Joe, the publisher at Historia Research Press in Chicago. If you're joining us for the first time, one of our authors, our only author, is reading to his mother during the COVID-19 pandemic and lockdown. They are, of course, apart in different states, and this is one of the ways in which they are trying to stay in touch during this period of time. So, um, chapter 2, the origin of magic. Ooh, magic missiles. So as we have said on previous occasions, this author believes that some fantastic world existed in the distant past of our world history, and he is telling a story complete and with footnotes and illustrations and maps that would seem to suggest that an ancient civilization long, long ago knew how to control forces in the universe that we no longer understand. If that bit of insanity doesn't drive you away, I'm forced to introduce the author of Arcane Cage, being a historical narrative of fantastic events during the decline and fall of the Provenance. Hi, Mom. I'm happy you enjoyed Chapter 2 of Arcane Cage on the origins of arcane philosophy, classical powers, or what skeptics call magic. I hadn't considered that you would read along in your copy. It's an excellent idea because it's really intended to be read in hard copy with all the footnotes and illustrations and other aspects of it that bring to life this ancient civilization. It's available on Kindle as well. The Kindle version is a print replica of the paperback, and so every page is formatted exactly as if it were a paperback page, and the footnotes are there, and the illustrations in the positions in which I've been reading it. So, as I mentioned previously, the first chapter is not meant to be more than a chronicle of significant persons, places, things, and events from the preternatural and arcane ages. The second chapter then truly launches us into our narrative as it introduces the origins of arcane philosophy or the classical powers during this period of time. Now, many people find this to be incredible, the literal meaning of which is not believable, and I just choose to differ. One of my most inspiring authors I've ever come across is Thorsten Veblen. He wrote on many subjects, but one of them was the higher learning in America in the late 7th century of the Golden Age. Now, higher learning is associated with the universities and academic and scientific discovery, but he made a point of emphasizing that all civilizations in the past as well as the present have a pursuit of esoteric knowledge, a way of knowing the world that is difficult for others to comprehend. So there's no real reason to disregard or disbelieve that the Provenance, the Lyman, and the Domain as a whole didn't have its own higher learning in the distant past. As hinted in Chapter 2, this new form of knowledge introduces certain frictions between the rulers and the ruled in this society, leading to the Glorious Revolution. And Chapter 3 covers this history briefly in order to introduce the origins of both the Arcane Age and the Provenance. Chapter 3, on the importance of the Provenance for the future. A verse. Immortals become mortals, mortals become immortals, we live in each other's deaths, we die in each other's lives. End verse. Footnote 1. Scotanus, on Nature, fragment 269, published in Titios, in the first epoch, second period of the preternatural age. Again, Rank Schrift's metrical rendition from the first arcane philosophers serves as the definitive translation of the Rogue's original text. I have made minor edits in the interest of clarity for contemporary scholars and students. And footnote. A verse. Immortals become mortals, mortals become immortals. We live in each other's deaths, we die in each other's lives. The cryptic lines of Scotanus, the most accomplished rogue, the most feared rogue of the Glorious Revolution, capture in a few words the delicate relationship between the godheads and the people after the advent of arcane philosophy. Every advance in the classical powers seemingly diminished the godheads, and in response every effort to sustain veneration of the godheads impeded the study of arcane philosophy. While foolishness suggests that the Glorious Revolution was inevitable, in history the crucible of civil war often dissolves that which a nation, its people, proves incapable of resolving by other means. Dissolves, that is, because no nation, no people, at the end of a civil war, remains the same after bloody conflict. And yet every nation, every people, goes to war to protect itself, to preserve its traditions, and to restore its sense of natural order. That paradox is never more evident when nations or states disappear entirely in the course of war, giving birth to new nations and new borders. In those instances where the warring sides once shared the same form of government, we name the conflicts revolutions, as in the Glorious Revolution, our world's first civil war and the first social revolution to end with the invention of a new form of government. The tenuous peace between the godheads and the arcanists, following the trial of Agrigentum, persisted for several centuries. In arcane terms, at least 7 epochal primes. Footnote 2. Epochal prime, or epoch, being the unit of measure for periods of 137 years, suggesting the tense arrangement lasted 500 and more years. End footnote. In arcane terms, at least 7 epochal primes, long enough to uncover many feats of the first 7 classes of arcane philosophy. During that era, the godhead's suspicion for popular education and acrimony for the archonists who treated the commoners without regard for the godhead's consent grew incrementally. In the final analysis, a single seminal discovery sent the preternatural age, pregnant with the godhead's animosity, into oblivion. See Illustration 5. Illustration 5, Timeline of the Preternatural Age. The preternatural age extends back into prehistory. The final 8 epochal primes, or 137-year periods, begins with the advent of writing. Each epoch is divided into 8 periods of approximately 17 years, descending from 8 to 1. Without the benefit of specific dates, preternatural events are cited as epoch and period. For example, 6 vertical bar 3 to represent the 3rd period of the 6th epoch, the time Agrigentum published on Nature. The preternatural age comes to a close at the Glorious Revolution, the end of the 1st epoch and 1st period. End Illustration 5. In the final analysis, a single seminal discovery sent the preternatural age, pregnant with the godhead's animosity, into oblivion. That discovery? The clerical power to raise the dead. The cleric's abilities to heal the sick and dying already possessed, in the popular preternatural mind, an uncanny power that defied the godheads. Where once the commoners had been slaves broken and short-lived, the clerical arts made them laborers. Hard-working, yes, but also comfortable and long-lived, as never before, creating conditions that allowed the masses to recast themselves into a middling sort. When the clerics revealed a power that seemed to erase all distinction between mortal and immortal, the tenuous peace came to an abrupt end. One document in the archives of the Interpolis Commoners Association, ICA, commends the incendiary group a unique place in the annals of the Domain, its short account of the Glorious Revolution. Footnote 3. Interpolis Commoners Association, On War, published in Naxos, in the 12th epoch of an unknown period of the Arcane Age. A pamphlet of 41 leaves circulated by the association's General Council at the height of the First Great War. The text has had an eventful past, lost and rediscovered several times. The only definitive copy, now in existence, is held by the Institute of Arcane Philosophy at Bakhtin, Moscow State University in Russia. The Institute graciously granted access to the pamphlet, and the translation is my own from the original text. End footnote. Its short account of the Glorious Revolution. Though the ICA disappeared into obscurity in the early years of the Metal Age, the leaders of the radical organization influenced indelibly our consciousness of the past. The ICA documents are the oldest in our archives to classify the periods of Demen history in the manner that remains current to this day: preternatural, arcane, metal, and golden, our age. Footnote 4. Although not known to have access to the treaties of the association, Mad Mitz seems to have been unwittingly influenced by the ICA when he divided the ages of world history into 4 parts. On this point, however, it must be noted that the ICA scorned the outcome of the First Great War. In its view, the mechanic arts ultimately won the second major conflict of the Demen. Boldly, the association then predicted that the mercantile cartels would one day displace the mechanic arts to become the hegemonic power in the world. The pamphlet coined the phrase Golden Age to signify a future in the everyday life of the Demen ruled by gold coins and mercantile interests, not peace, as we triumphantly teach our schoolchildren. In this account from the ICA, war over a question of wealth and stature, in our eyes, will become the absurdity of an age, on a quest for preponderance, no more than a criminal fatuity. From On War, Leaf 41. End footnote. According to the pamphlet On War, the people per se did not launch the violent campaign for liberation in our distant past, nor was the war decidedly orchestrated on the people's behalf. Instead, according to the ICA, the Godheads and the 3 middling interests provoked the first great conflict of the Demen. In contrast to modern scholarship, which marks each age with a mundane leap in technology under labels such as Arcane Revolution, Ironworks Revolution, Print Revolution, Industrial Revolution, and Digital Revolution, the ICA explicitly credits the 3 world conflicts as turning points between each of the ages of the Demen for reasons that modern scholarship now largely neglects. Footnote 5. We concern ourselves in this work with the consequences and age that followed the Glorious Revolution. A summation of events and foretelling described in the pamphlets of the Interpolis Commoners Association, now in scholars' possession, will provide the modern reader with enough perspective to understand the place of our Golden Age in the interpretation of the great conflicts. That is, according to these radicals. As mentioned, the ICA asserted that great conflicts in the Demen have nothing to do with the liberation of the people. In the Glorious Revolution, the classical powers deposed the Godheads who ruled the original 7 cities of the Demen and set themselves up as potentates to rule the cities. Near the end of the Arcane Age, the mechanic arts harnessed terrestrial powers, wind, water, fire, and earth, eventually leading to a revolt against the vested interests of the classical powers, bringing the realm of the Provenance to an end. After the fall of the Arcanists and the loss of the classical powers following the First Great War, the mechanic artists and their manufactories dominated world history, what we now know as the Long Metal Age. Lastly, after networks of world trade resulted in great wealth for the mercantile cartels, a second great war elevated the mercantile cartels and the merchant families that have since forged a permanent hegemony in world history. The correspondence between the ICA and later historians, who formally defined the 4 ages, is nothing less than puzzling. End footnote. Although its larger argument on the causes of war proposes little of substance for the present study, the ICA pamphlet offers significant details on the origins of the Glorious Revolution. Its history lends support to a popular account of the First Continental Conflict of the Demen, a fantastic tale of Revolutionary War celebrated in folk songs heard only in the people's taverns for many centuries. Footnote 6. We modern citizens of world history unwittingly celebrate our national holidays to commemorate freedom and independence won in war or revolution. The tippling classes, to use Erasco Lude's colorful phrase, have long expressed skepticism for freedoms that provided no respite from a hard life. End footnote. A fantastic tale of Revolutionary War celebrated in folk songs heard only in the people's taverns for many centuries. Though most modern scholars scoffed at brewery patrons' tall tales as dubious and unfounded aspersions with no evidence of support in the archival materials of the past. Footnote 7. The author of the line shall remain unnamed so as not to unduly besmirch his otherwise passable scholarship. End footnote. Though most modern scholars scoffed at brewery patrons' tall tales as dubious and unfounded aspersions with no evidence to support in the archival materials of the past, the collective memory of uneducated souses may have sprouted from the seeds of dissent planted by a revolutionary intelligentsia several millenniums ago. The ICA tract asserts that the Glorious Revolution began when each of the 7 cities descended into bloody civil wars at the direction of the Godheads. Footnote 8. This, of course, contradicts the Alcyonius fragment that suggests the Paladins initiated the Glorious Revolution at the behest of the people. Traditional historians have long known about the Alcyonius fragment and accept the document at face value as support for the historical narrative that depicts the ages of the Demesne as a progressive march to liberty and prosperity. See Brew's discussion in his Naxian Ethic, pages 211 to 227. End footnote. The ICA tract asserts that the Glorious Revolution began when each of the 7 cities descended into bloody civil wars at the direction of the Godheads. Before the onset of the war, among those who mastered the wisdoms of the 4 elements, common arcanists outnumbered noble arcanists by at least 5 to 1. The nobles as a whole, and select commoners serving in the Hecatomononker, who betrayed their rank to the state, conspired to suppress the commoners once again, unleashing their classical powers and mercenary brutality on arcanists who the Godheads deemed too favorable to the welfare of the commoners. The coordinated and unforeseen maneuver by the nobles of the 7 cities straightway evened the contest, leaving similar numbers of philosophers on the sides of the Godheads and the commoners. In the conflict that ensued, many more philosophers, noble and common, died in defense of their interests or ideals. In Alcyonius, the struggle between the paladins descended into an especially horrific spectacle. Without a noble class, the paladins split along lines of principled obedience to the Godhead and righteous defense of the commoners. Both sides fervently believed that lawfulness and the public good favored their side. In skirmish after skirmish, paladins engaged each other in zealous fights to the death. For mundane commoners, conditions grew dire. It mattered not what side the working folk chose, allegiance to their godhead or their benefactors, for scrums and assassinations carried out by those who possessed none of the wisdoms brought the horrors of war to Alcyonius. Footnote 9. From ICA on War, Leaf 5. End footnote. It mattered not what side the working folk chose, allegiance to their godhead or their benefactors, for scrums and assassinations carried out by those who possessed none of the wisdoms brought the horrors of war to Alcyonius. Many commoners who lived well only because of the spirit of community fostered in the desert city soon fled when famine and shortages of water incited hoarding, retribution, and opportunism for a black market in essential goods. Ultimately, the treachery of the Godheads and nobles sparked revolutions that resulted in the closing of the preternatural age and in its divine order. What began as an act of state terrorism to prop up the old theocracies turned into a series of usurpations to erect new forms of totalitarianism throughout the Demesne. In truth, it may have been only a question of time before enterprising arcanists eclipsed the Godheads, all of which had become no more than figureheads in their city-states long before the putschs that drove them from power. No doubt, though, the Godheads' schemes and aggressions accelerated their own demise. In the span of just a few years, the spells and feats gained in merciless battle overshadowed the totality of advancements made during centuries of studied research in the city's lyceums and guilds. Such advances came at a heavy price in life and justice that many, too many, willingly paid in personal quests for glory. The philosophers who survived the earliest years of the conflict gained such power that the abilities of the mightiest arcanists could not be opposed by 101 apprentices in the 7th year of their studies. In the words of the ICA, war is the breeding ground of the greatest inequalities. Footnote 10. From ICA on War, Leaf 17. The passage describes the arcane power gained by the usurper of Agrinio. End footnote. In the words of the ICA, war is the breeding ground of the greatest inequalities. After 7 winters of conflict in the city of the rogues, Titios fell to a scoundrel who possessed imponderable powers of demonry. Pylene, Libua, Agrinio, and Naxos soon followed, deposing the godheads and elevating a noble master of their city's primary classical power to the station of emperor. In Alcyoneus, the godhead abdicated after the brutality of the paladins threatened to raise the entire city into the sands. In the godhead's stead, the paladins appointed the most powerful of their class, an arcanist who fought for law above public good and who governed without regard for the conditions of the common stock of Alcyoneus. All 6 emperors imprisoned the godheads in the palatial dungeons, ending permanently the divine worship they ostensibly supported at the outset of the civil wars. Only Panoptes, were the mortified godhead, entreated the wizards of Agrigentum's tower for protection and ensnared the faithless nobility in a trap, escaped the fate of noble usurpation. There the philosophers and commoners of Panoptes routed the nobles with the support of Agrigentum's wizards and the godhead. While the actions of the godhead saved the city from noble dictatorship, the commoners spurned the fickle treason of their high lord and banished the godhead from the district henceforth. Footnote 11. The godhead of Panoptes disappeared from history according to the ICA. On War, Leaf 19. While the actions of the godhead saved the city from noble dictatorship, the commoners spurned the fickle treason of their high lord and banished the godhead from the district henceforth. The deities of the preternatural age, who ruled the peoples of the Demesne in their 7 comfortless cities, with 100 iron fists and a coin purse, slipped feebly into prehistoric mythology. At the close of the preternatural age, noble arcanists seized 5 of the 7 cities, while law-minded paladins established a new totalitarianism in Alcyoneus. Common arcanists controlled Panoptes, although the complete Caesarea rupture with divine and noble rule left the city without a civic constitution of any kind. War exhaustion, more so than peace, brought most of the open conflict to an end across the Demesne. In the 5 cities ruled by the nobility, the emperors declared the people free from the absolute tyranny of the godheads. In Alcyoneus, the ruling junta triumphantly proclaimed the people fed. No amount of political freedom satisfies the hungry masses. Footnote 12. ICA, On War, Leaf 19 again. End footnote. In Alcyoneus, the ruling junta triumphantly proclaimed the people fed. No amount of political freedom satisfies the hungry masses. The conditions of the commoners certainly worsened during the brief reign of nobles long accustomed to the sinecures of state office and power. Having little need for armed mercenaries for their protection, the noble juntas conferred greater stature on the purse-bearers in the mercantile cartels. Footnote 13. Merchants also won a revision to the state law that required merchants to give up an arm as security for their faithfulness to the state. While that provided no immediate redress for current office holders, more and more merchants' sons and daughters agreed to carry on their parents' businesses in subsequent years, eventually leading to the accumulation of family wealth that characterized the late Middle Age. End footnote. Having little need for armed mercenaries for their protection, the noble juntas conferred greater stature on the purse-bearers in the mercantile cartels. Such as it was, enterprising purse-bearers who knew the extent to which arcanists and mechanic artists exchanged many valuable wares and services amongst themselves, often paying each other with gold coins, convinced the emperors of the fundamental changes that the classical powers introduced to the political economies of the city-states. Rather than collect a tithe of goods and foodstuffs from the commoners once per year, the merchants recommended that the emperors demand all payments in coinage and on a more frequent basis, each transaction. Footnote 14. As a result, the last classical power, discovered during the preternatural age, was the sales tax. The mercantile reforms are taken from a translation of the partially restored text from the Middle Epochs of the Arcane Age, Nolos, First Laws of the Provenance, stanza 13, published in Panoptes around the 8th Epoch, 3rd period of the Arcane Age. End footnote. Rather than collect a tithe of goods and foodstuffs from the commoners once per year, the merchants recommended that the emperors demand all payments in coinage and on a more frequent basis, each transaction. Quickly, the new bursaries of the nobles' governments impoverished the productive interests of the cities with regressive taxes favoring the wealthy, and subjected the commoners to the disciplinary regime of the mercantile cartels. In Panoptes, an untested experiment in self-governance nearly collapsed under the weight of personal acrimony and intolerance for political faction. In the years after driving the treacherous nobles and the godhead from the city's jurisdiction, the Panopticons invited the wizards of Agrigentum to translate the ethical code of their eponym, outlined in the final 1,669 lines of her magisterial work, into a system of government to the benefit of all city dwellers. The wizards proposed two bodies to conduct the affairs of state, in which the Arcanists, as the wizards ever remained partial to Agrigentum's term, selected representatives to a High Council, while the commoners elected legislators to a People's Council. Footnote 15. Although the written constitution of Panoptes was destroyed during the First Great War, the system of republicanism introduced in this arcane city became an archetype for future constitutions and governments in the domain. The bicameral government created two bodies, such as our senates and congresses, to jointly legislate the laws of the city and foster a unification of minds. The few songs and fables passed down to us suggest that Panoptes also incorporated such ideas as fixed terms for office holders and divided the responsibilities of state between executive, legislative, and judicial branches during the Arcane Age. See Dormason, Glory of the Empire, page 311. End footnote. The Arcanists selected representatives to a High Council, while the commoners elected legislators to a People's Council. The modern vantage perhaps too easily discerns the reasoning behind the division of state into two councils as a balance of powers. The wizards of Agrigentum, however, understood governance as a proper combination of elements, an analogy directly lifted from their understanding of the classical powers. After the godhead and the nobles were driven from power, only two political classes of the late preternatural age seemed to shape the contours of society: the arcane philosophers and the commoners. Accordingly, the denizens of Panoptes readily grasped the logic of the wizard's proposals and the analogy with Agrigentum's work on the elements of nature. Footnote 16. By the end of the preternatural age, it was widely known that the ability to use classical powers was not hereditary. This meant that two powerful arcanists may produce a child with no abilities whatsoever, but also that two parents without classical powers may reproduce a child of great distinction. As a result, parents who did not distinguish themselves in the classical arts often taught their children about Agrigentum's work at a very young age in hopes that their sons and daughters may one day fulfill their frustrated dreams to become powerful arcanists. Though the evidence is not entirely conclusive, several archaeologists now believe that the architectural design of residences near the end of the preternatural age indicate that there was also a population explosion prior to the Glorious Revolution, perhaps reflecting parents' expectations for a better life from their talented children. See Uma F. Couchelet, Histoire de la sexualité arcanique, le volant de pouvoir classique. History of Arcane Sexuality, The Will to Classical Powers. Published in Paris, 839 of the Golden Age. End footnote. In an alignment, then, the wizards and commoners of Panoptes constituted the first republic of the domain. In the midst of the primary elections to public office, the commoners of the new state enthused about our sacred duty to preserve new freedoms, to perpetuate the justice of self-rule. The wizards congratulated themselves on their new system of government and what the new commonwealth meant for posterity. A verse. A beacon to the peoples of the domain, the provenance of a prosperous future. End verse. Footnote 17. The quote comes from a cylindrical ivory container, possibly for scrolls, recovered at the Titios dig several years ago. Artifact number 4513.1, held by the Commercial Academy for the Study of the Arcane Powers, LLC. At the top of the cylinder is the symbol representing Panoptes. Next to an image of a common farmer, the first line is etched. Near the image of a wizard, the second line is etched. For the modern world, the artifact records one of the oldest references to the provenance. Materials analysis and carbon dating suggest the artifact originated in Panoptes around the first epoch, 5th period of the Arcane Age. End footnote. A verse. A beacon to the peoples of the domain, the provenance of a prosperous future. End verse. What worked well in theory, though initially failed in practice. The constitution of Panoptes struggled to account for the social conditions of the domain, after the advent of the classical powers and the end of the godhead's hegemony during the preternatural age. The godheads gave each of their states a unique set of moral values and ethical codes, venerated in the distinct Statement of Principles for the City of ... or insert name. Before the classical powers and the migration of the peoples of the domain, the cities remained relatively pacific because the denizens adhered to the same principles upheld by a single godhead. When each of the 7 cities established places of learning for the classical powers first discovered within its walls, free spirits crossed borders and settled in foreign cities most closely aligned with individual opportunity rather than social mores. Regional mobility formed a citizenry following vastly different principles of conduct and justice from the first denizens to settle the cities. When the Glorious Revolution commenced, the social differences became strongly pronounced in Panoptes. Whereas magicians' apprentices trekked to Panoptes from the other 6 cities annually, few commoners bothered to relocate to the metropolis that investigated the most abstruse and unwieldy wisdom. In these circumstances, few wizards held principles in common with local commoners. The High Council and the People's Council of Panoptes failed to agree on a single piece of legislation during the first 2 years and 5 months of the new government. Footnote 18. All in all, an innocuous piece of legislation set aside the first and 7th days of each week as a day of respite from the toils of work, a day to indulge the spoils of freedom. Potentially an arcane precursor of our weekends. The 2 lines are taken from Nolos, First Laws of the Provenance, stanza 29. End footnote. In all 7 cities, acts of public humiliation and covert assassinations fueled hatred between denizens who hailed from different cities and principles. Those who sided with the godheads against the commoners at the outset of the conflict, like the Hekaroman and Kev, committed the most grievous offenses, albeit covert violence against the nobles proved no less ordinary. The populations depleted storehouses in the winter without replenishing supplies in the autumn. The exuberance for arcane philosophy during the late preternatural age stultified. Arcane masters trained their apprentices unsuitably, fearful that the potential of a young apprentice might threaten their new authority over the classical powers. The whole domain grappled with the severe economic depression that plunged many into destitution and shame. The state of affairs for the new emperors and for the councils of the Republic of Panoptes progressed as if headed for ungodly anarchy. Footnote 19. Conditions that the ICA reason serve to show how war always ensues to impoverish the commoners of both hope and prosperity. See On War, leaves 23 to 29. End footnote. In the West, events turned the conflict in a new direction when a mysterious arcanist displaced the emperor and nobles of Tityos. The rogues who escaped death carried news to the closest cities of Libua, Agrinio, and Alcyonius. They described a sorcerer. Footnote 20. The unusual spelling and capitalization of the term sorcerer is found in the surviving arcane texts. The modification is imitated throughout this work. End footnote. In the West, events turned the conflict in a new direction when a mysterious arcanist displaced the emperor and nobles of Tityos. The rogues who escaped death carried news to the closest cities of Libua, Agrinio, and Alcyonius. They described a sorcerer, far more powerful than all that preceded him, who declared himself the supreme law of the domain. The new lord demanded unwieldy fealty from the arcanists in the city of Tityos, initiating pogroms to destroy all apostates who defied the sorcerer's command. After an exodus in the first few months of the terror, no further news or persons escaped Tityos for a period of 5 years. For the most part, it mattered not, since the other emperors and Panoptes councils preoccupied themselves with the precarious situations and explosive conditions of their individual city-states. Quietly, the final storm of the Glorious Revolution gathered in Tityos. As the first thaw of spring followed the 5th year of unrest in Tityos, the Western Citadel launched an awesome and potent campaign of conquest against its neighbors. For scholars of the arcane past, scant details of the battles and the early contests over the future of our world exist. The extant records written in an allegorical verse reference phenomena defying modern comprehension. Nonetheless, the documents show that Agrinio, Libua, and Alcyoneus surrendered to the forces of Tityos. As the movement of military forces across the terrain of the domain took a great deal of time, the best estimates suggest 3 years passed from the moment the armies of Tityos left their gates to the surrender of the paladins at Alcyoneus. The conquered cities appear to have offered little resistance to the growing horde of Tityos. For instance, the law-abiding paladins of Alcyoneus threw open the gates to the Titian horde despite only a brief siege that had not yet threatened the supply of foodstuffs then held by the city. As in Tityos, missives and travelers from the subdued cities entirely ceased soon after the defeat. Whatever the explanation, in a matter of only 3 years, 4 of the 7 cities of the Godheads found themselves subject to a sovereign, by all accounts more ruthless and more autocratic than any of the former Godheads. The domain teetered on the precipice of a new and redoubtable despotism. Footnote 21. The short prosaic narrative of the ICA's On War, Leaf 31, substantiates in part the more complete account in the poem The Ends of the Gods, attributed to the bard Cime in the early epochs of the Arcane Age, published in Pellene around the 3rd epoch, 5th period of the Arcane Age. Subsequent citations of Cime's poem are my translation from the original. End footnote. The domain teetered on the precipice of a new and redoubtable despotism. The obscurity of the past, for the most part, envelops the size and nature of the forces that the sovereign of Tityos marshaled and unleashed on the free peoples of the domain. The arcanists of the 4 fallen cities, the ones willing or able to in any case, fled westward to Pellene, Naxos, and Panoptes to contribute their arms to the resistance. They brought with them intelligence on a new arcane philosophy empowering the sorcerer of Tityos to command hideous beasts known as the Dragons of Blue. Footnote 22. The most learned interpretation of the poem The Ends of the Gods argues that blue denotes the sky and not the color of the dragons. The argument states that most persons who survived to tell the tale first caught sight of the dragons when they descended from the skies at midday. The poem identifies each of the dragons of blue with an additional color. Belle et Pochons, The Power of Dragon Myths, published in the Provenance History Review, Volume 37, Number 1, 859 of the Golden Age, on pages 167 to 181. End footnote. They brought with them intelligence of a new arcane philosophy empowering the sorcerer of Tityos to command hideous beasts, known as the Dragons of Blue. The rangers of Agrinio carried the initial reports, stunned that arrows and swords failed to penetrate the scaly defenses of the beast. A verse. A solitary winged snake hewn from rubies preceded the deformed hordes of Tityos. The druids of Libua frightfully claimed 2 mighty serpents emblazoned red and green, dreadful, descended from the blue to discharge for our misdeeds the wrath of the Godheads. End verse. In Alcyoneus, the chilling accounts of the few survivors who managed to cross the deserts undetected and unconsumed condensed their ordeal into a few terrifying lines. A verse. The 3-headed behemoth, red, green, and black, breathed bright lashes of insufferable pain, ere alighting in the palace atrium to feast on the singed flesh of the emperor. End verse. Footnote 23. From the Ends of the Gods, stanza 5 and stanza 7. End footnote. A verse. The 3-headed behemoth, red, green, and black, breathed bright lashes of insufferable pain, ere alighting in the palace atrium to feast on the singed flesh of the emperor. End verse. One by one, the deformed hordes of Tityos occupied the citadels of the western domain. The armies of Tityos turned south after Libua to assault Alcyoneus, granting the denizens of the 3 easternmost cities more time to prepare their defenses. The wizards of Panoptes deduced that the increasing number of dragons, after the fall of each city, linked the imprisoned godheads to the beast. The High Council sent word to Naxos and Pellene that the sorcerer of Tityos unlocked an enigma of the godheads ere unknown. The only hope for the western cities to avoid the fates of Agrinio, Libua, and Alcyoneus stemmed from the potential of the wizards of Agrigentum to unleash the dragons of the last 2 godheads, Wasting no time, the High Council contracted the fastest druids in winged form to carry a request to both cities to surrender their imprisoned godheads to Panoptes. The High Council aimed to learn and wield the power of dragons to defend the eastern cities. In Pallene, the Emperor of the Fighters, distrustful of the Republic of Panoptes, rejected the wizard's entreaty. Contriving to turn the armies of Tityos upon Naxos or Panoptes, the Emperor insidiously determined to dispose of his imprisoned godhead in the molten lava running through the forge of the city. The denizens, thirsty for justice and hungry for bread, gathered at the forge to witness the judgment carried out on the former deity. When the godhead threatened the city, the Emperor hesitated. The large crowd murmured in disapproval, while a few vocal onlookers shouted menacing threats at the Emperor. The explosive assembly was diffused only after a person, who had no known abilities in the classical powers, emerged from the assembly and tossed the disgraced godhead into the volcanic furnace. A verse. Trembling with rage, the godhead menaced Pallene. No mercy for faithless executioners. The Emperor cringed, fearing the lawgiver. A commoner, no arcanist, then stepped forward and heaved the dross into its infernal grave. End verse. Footnote 24. The Ends of the Gods, stanza 29. The amusing story indicates just how little commoners honored, or feared, the former godheads of the cities. During the Arcane Age, noble lore held that volcanic eruptions and earthquakes were the work of the godhead who sought to rise from the ashes of the underworld in vengeance for the faithless and treacherous acts of the ancestors of Pallene. End footnote. A verse. Trembling with rage, the godhead menaced Pallene. No mercy for faithless executioners. The Emperor cringed, fearing the lawgiver. A commoner, no arcanist, then stepped forward and heaved the dross into its infernal grave. End verse. The city-state of fighters braced for war with the sorcerer of Tityos. The nobles and commoners refused to abandon the high ground, as the Emperor commanded, and entrenched their forces in the mountain posts for a final conflict. In solidarity, despite the machinations of the Emperor, the cities of Naxos and Panoptes each sent a contingent of arcanists to aid in the defense of Pallene. Regrettably, the remaining stanzas of the epic poem, The Ends of the Gods, that celebrated the brave stand of the guardians of Pallene against the onslaught of 4 dragons, tell us little else. A subsequent stanza suggests the nobles and commoners of the 3 eastern cities set aside their differences and joined in a courageous defense of the city. The warriors eventually lost their citadel. They nonetheless repelled the advances of the hordes of Tityos for over 3 years, a heroic stand that literally altered the history of the domain. Footnote 25. Ever altering the fate of Provenance. From the Ends of the Gods, stanza 37. End footnote. A heroic stand that literally altered the history of the domain. In contrast to Pallene, the city of Naxos responded to the entreaty of the High Council of Panoptes more favorably. When the Emperor of Naxos appeared likely to reject the extradition of their godhead to the wizards, to the mobs of Panoptes he sneered. The majority of nobles broke from the regime and deposed the Emperor. The ruling cadre of nobles quickly dispatched a message to Panoptes promising to deliver the imprisoned godhead to the wizards, provided that the High Council and People's Council admit the denizens of Naxos to their republic as full citizens. The 2 councils, able to work deliberately when confronted by the imminent threat of Tityos, agreed on legislation to allow Naxos to send elected clerics and commoners to the ruling councils of the Provenance. A mere 5 months after the High Council approached the city with its request, the citizens of Naxos deposed their emperor, surrendered their imprisoned godhead to the wizards, and entered into a federation with Panoptes, an event commemorated in the aphorism, "We join with heart, hand, and head the Provenance." Footnote 26. From the End of the Gods, stanza 41. Several of the surrounding stanzas do not exist, and the quote is not directly attributed to the people or emissaries of Naxos. Based on the content of the passages that follow, it seems incontestable that the quote comes from the first residents of Naxos, elected to serve on the councils. Notably, the decision to admit Naxos to the Republic of Panoptes forever altered the composition of the two councils. First, the decision to grant the denizens of Naxos some form of proportional representation more than doubled the size of the councils. The legislation also formally gave clerics and wizards an equal station as arcanists. In addition, the general character of the ruling bodies, the People's Council in particular, dramatically shifted to reflect the values of the Naxian representatives and statement of principles. The subsequent factionalism in the People's Council actually made the body more sympathetic to compromises that routinely took place in the High Council and rendered the legislative process of the Provenance more productive. End footnote. A mere 5 months after the High Council approached the city with this request, the citizens of Naxos deposed their emperor, surrendered their imprisoned godhead to the wizards, and entered into a federation with Panoptes, an event commemorated in the aphorism, "We join with heart, hand, and head the Provenance." Indeed, the citizens of Panoptes and Naxos were the first peoples of the domain to call the worldwide conflagration between the godheads and the classical powers the Glorious Revolution. At that time, and for many, many heptadecade decades to come, the citizens of Panoptes and Naxos preserved the memory of the world's first social revolution. To quote the opening verse of The Ends of the Gods, "The crucible of war forged the Provenance." Footnote 27. Verse 1, the popular rendering of the line. In the Golden Age, we have become quite familiar with this one line from the epic poem, mistakenly regarding it as an endorsement for militarism and the public funding of standing armies in peacetime. End footnote. To quote the opening verse of The Ends of the Gods, "The crucible of war forged the Provenance." The reconstituted People's Council of the Provenance quickly set out to fortify the fighting denizens of Pallene with arms and crafts as quickly as the mechanic artists produced them, and as long as the mercantile cartels kept open secret routes of trade into the beleaguered mountain fortress. The High Council largely dedicated its wizards and clerics to discovering what mysteries, if any, the godhead of Naxos harbored. The new government demonstrated a magical ability to work effectively in crisis that none could have foreseen in its first years. What followed is quite frankly inscrutable. While the siege at Pallene delayed the hordes of Tityos, the wizards of Panoptes and the clerics of Naxos successfully cracked the riddle of the godheads. The wizards of Agrigentum, who for many years studied the Book of Nature, in their tower somehow transformed the godhead into a many-colored dragon. Footnote 28. Like the other dragons, the florid account of the conflict in epic poems give the dragon of Panoptes several different names: many-colored, prismatic, and gold. Scholars for the most part agree that these names refer to the same phenomena. End footnote. The wizards of Agrigentum, who for many years studied the Book of Nature in their tower, somehow transformed the godhead into the many-colored dragon. By the time the forces of the sorcerer recovered their strength and decamped from the ruins of Pallene, the wizards and clerics fully mastered the latent potentialities of the Naxian godhead. Frustrated by the murder of the godhead of Pallene, the mysterious sorcerer turned the armies of Tityos against Naxos before a fourth winter could pass. From this point, the arcane record of the conflict best speaks for itself, as our most erudite scholars have not yet reached any consensus on the meaning of the passage. A verse. Panoptes sundered the godhead of Naxos to decipher the many-colored dragon. The valor of Pallene stretched the cord of time, ever altering the fate of Provenance. The blessed clerics, ... End of this line is lost. The imperial sphere of the golden dragon. End verse. Several lines about the sorcerer of Tityos appear to be missing at this point. The existing fragments of the verse end with the final battle. A verse. Over the laden forest outside Naxos, the prismatic serpent of the Provenance made prostrate the four serpents of Tityos. The gold dragon then joined beginning with end, banished the white worm to the icy barrens, cast the green drake beyond the waterless sands, interred the black demon above the night sky, drowned the red snake under the eastern ocean, then itself flew beyond the false horizon. End verse. Footnote 29. From the Ends of the Gods, stanzas 43 to 47. It's difficult to discern between the literal and figural meaning of the verse. One element stands out. Each of the dragons became identified with what may be called its opposite liman. The first mention of the white worm follows the fall of Alcyoneus, the hot and southern desert city. To banish the white worm to the northern barrens is to associate hot and cold. The green drake from the lush forests and lakes of the north was cast southward beyond the lifeless desert sands. The earth and black demon of the central plains interred in the dark sky, and the fiery red snake of western Tityos drowned in the tempestuous ocean. The final line suggests that the gold dragon settled over the western horizon, giving the four cardinal limans, north, south, east, west, the sky, and the earth, if we include the fate of Peline's godhead, an association with one of the dragons, 6 dragons, and deposed godheads of the preternatural age. End footnote. Over the laden forests outside Naxos, the prismatic serpent of the Provenance made prostrate the 4 serpents of Tityos. The gold dragon then joined beginning with end, banished the white worm to the icy barrens, cast the great drake beyond the waterless sands, interred the black demon above the night sky, drowned the red snake under the eastern ocean, then flew itself beyond the false horizon. These are the closing lines of the ends of the gods, which provide no further account of the first great conflict of the Daemon. Remarkably, the text gives no indication of the fate of the sorcerer who unleashed the dragons on the peoples of the Daemon, as if the defeat of the dragons ended the glorious revolution decisively. The Interpolis Commoners Association also suggested that the Battle of the Dragons ended the glorious revolution after 17 years of strife and vengeance among the peoples of the Daemon. Combat, disease, and famine killed an estimated 80% or more of the population in the 7 cities of the preternatural age. Even Panoptes and Naxos suffered from war exhaustion to the degree that the 2 cities proved incapable of mounting a counteroffensive against the sorcerer Tityos in the far west. The surviving arcanists of the Provenance drove the remnants of the armies of Tityos as far west as the edge of the Pharos Mountains, leading to Pallene, then returned to rebuild their guilds and the structures destroyed over the course of many years of civil war. The guilds of the classical powers and mechanic arts that lost their cities in the west during the war resettled in Naxos and Panoptes to establish new societies to apprentice the promising youth of the 2 cities. The mercantile cartels did their best to establish safe passage between the 2 cities, but lawlessness and brigandage became a part of everyday life in the Provenance. At the close of the glorious revolution, recovery from the civil war that decimated the cities would take many, many generations. Footnote 30. ICA on War, Leaf 37. End footnote. The guilds of the classical powers were also in disarray. The noble philosophers, including the former emperor of Naxos, gathered together the untalented nobles and misguided commoners who refused to participate in the mob mentality of the republican experiment in Panoptes. The anti-republicans led small tribes into the wilderness of the West Liman to reestablish the noble values and form worshipful communities to remember the garden of the Godhead's munificence. Footnote 31. Few expatriate nobles and their communities re-enter history. It should be noted, after the Glorious Revolution, the West Liman began on the outskirts of the city-states of Panoptes and Naxos. The Pharos Mountains to the west, extending from Panoptes to Naxos, formed the first natural border separating the Provenance from the Liman. That is, the vast majority of the Daemon fell under the auspices of the West Liman. From Vigras, Arcane Myths, page 131. End footnote. The anti-republicans led small tribes into the wilderness of the West Liman to reestablish the noble values and form worshipful communities to remember the garden of the Godhead's munificence. Common philosophers and arcanists driven from the western cities during the war assembled new political factions in the Provenance, intent on one day reclaiming their former homes. The wizards of Agrigentum, more invested in wisdom than in self-government and obsessed with the escape of the sorcerer of Tityos, returned to their tower to further study the Book of Nature. The wizards of Panoptes, whose numbers were in any case far inferior to the other classical powers, with the exception of the paladins, represented the arcane interest as best they could. Lastly, none of the other classical powers seemed to know quite what to do with the disreputable rogues of Tityos who made the eastern cities their new home. Consequently, the clerics of Naxos, whose cities survived the war relatively unscathed, grew in stature and managed many of the affairs of the High Council for several epochs. Under their leadership, during the ensuing millennium of the Arcane Age, the commonwealth of the Provenance spread across the continent to repopulate and incorporate 4 of the 5 preternatural cities lost in the Glorious Revolution: Pellene, Libua, Agrinio, and Alcyonius. Prior to the Arcane Age, the people of the Domain seem not to have divided themselves into cultures. The denizens of the 7 cities of the godheads during the preternatural age had no word to describe differences among the peoples of the 7 cities. After the Glorious Revolution, out from under the shadow of the godheads, the Domain flourished with a diversity of cultures never again witnessed in world history. Footnote 32. During the long reign of the godheads as well, the archival records have yet produced one indisputable reference to the vast variety of magical beasts that populate the Arcane Age. The anthropomorphic and bestial richness of the Arcane Age remains one of the world's enduring mysteries. The great multiplicity of cultures and creatures burst onto the age as if from the ashes of the godheads. End footnote. Prior to the Arcane Age, the peoples of the Domain seem not to have divided themselves into cultures. The denizens of the 7 cities, the godheads, during the preternatural age had no words to describe differences among the peoples of the 7 cities. After the Glorious Revolution, out from under the shadows of the godheads, the Domain flourished with a diversity of cultures never again witnessed in world history. In both the Provenance and the Lyman, these new cultures of the Domain evoke strong emotional attachments based on language and traditions. The diversity of the Lyman cultures and the persistence of conflict along the borders with the West Lyman subsequently shaped every facet of the history of the Provenance. One group with physical features akin to modern peoples came to be known as Anthropodon, a term no longer used in our day. Footnote 33. While it would be easy to confer the terms human and humanity on the peoples of Naxos and Panoptes, the designation would indicate that these 2 cities are our true ancestors. In point of fact, several millenniums of intercultural marriages and reproduction make moot the search for a single evolutionary branch or origin to modern humankind. While all the peoples of the Domain are correctly regarded as humanoid, only misguided researchers search for a true human ancestor from this motley period. End footnote. One group with physical features akin to modern peoples came to be known as Anthropodon, a term no longer used in our day. Anthropodon originated from the original 2 cities of the Provenance, but also inhabited territories of the Lyman, such as the ruins of Alcyonius. In the Provenance, the elves aligned themselves with the wizards of Agrigentum, while dwarves succeeded in recovering Pellene and its ancient smithy before the Provenance reclaimed the city. Half-elves became identified with the rangers and Orocthoi forests surrounding Agrinio, while both Anthropodon and Hemifus, or the half-crowns, reseeded the fields of Libua. Footnote 34. The 2 cultures of little people from the West Lyman, gnomes and Hemifus, settled in the re-established cities of the Provenance. Both cultures will be introduced where appropriate in the narrative. End footnote. More so than the Provenance, the West Lyman epitomizes the cultural wealth of the Arcane Age, as every imaginable type of hominid repopulated the Domain. Most cultures captured archaic ruins of the preternatural age or seized caves or other natural dwellings as shelter for their communities. Several cultures became nomadic, raiding the outposts and communities of sedentary societies. Animosities developed, such as those between the dwarves and the orcs. After heptadecades of petty conflict and combat frustrated all efforts at peace. On the whole, a fantastical age to the modern eye, or as one clever historian preferred to say, the arcane past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. Footnote 35. The noted arcane scholar and essayist Trey P. Hall, in Going Between the Arcane and Modern Worlds, published in the Provenantial Historical Review, Volume 41, Number 4, 863 of the Golden Age. And the quote comes from page 743. End footnote. On the whole, a fantastical age to the modern eye, or as one clever historian preferred to say, the arcane past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. A break in the narrative. Call it an author's aside. The above summary of the origins of the classical powers, the Glorious Revolution, and the Arcane Age must stand as a lengthy prologue to the events narrated in the remainder of this work. Certainly, many of my learned colleagues will object to an abridged history that brushes with such broad strokes the origins of the Arcane Age and the constitution of the Provenance. Other colleagues will perhaps condemn any citation of the intemperate ICA radicals who preached folk warfare on behalf of the commoners against the noble and middling ranks during the late Arcane Age. On the other hand, for new students of arcane history, what I have shared may seem overwhelming. 7 cities, 4 elements, 3 logics of time, 4 ages of the demand, 7 wisdoms or powers the students demand, 3 interests, 5 dragons, primal arithmetic, the provenance versus the alignment, commoners against nobles, high council and people's councils, 101 different names, and all complicated by philosophers or arcanists with incomprehensible powers and abilities forgotten long before our golden age. In this historian's defense, notwithstanding the obvious difficulty in the combination of academic scholarship on arcane history with a popular story for the modern consumer, footnote 36. While in graduate school, a professor, an aging curmudgeon, once told me, "Go to the bookstore to see how much shelf space is reserved for the history of recent wars and genocides preferred by modern readers. And yet the university demands that I train historians to write about democracy, labor, gender, multiculturalism, all manner of tacky postmodern cultural history that the masses will not consume." End footnote. In this historian's defense, notwithstanding the obvious difficulty in the combination of academic scholarship on arcane history with a popular story for the modern consumer, the brief synopsis on the foundational events of the Provenance outlines the place and time of the demand as Sidra knew them when she first entered the outer gates of the Acropolis one fine morning in the concluding years of the Arcane Age. This concludes Chapter 3 of Arcane Cage.